This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by landscape architects Andy Harris and Andy Sturgeon to explore the thinking behind the transformation of London's Sloane Street. Together, they tell the story of a project that set out to reimagine this 1 kilometre stretch as a green boulevard, inspired by the nearby Chelsea Physic Garden, shifting it from a traffic-dominated thoroughfare into a calmer, more human-centred place. We talk about how landscape can knit together retail and residential life, improve wellbeing, and encourage people not to just pass through, but to linger, using planting as environmental infrastructure. From underground constraints and traffic reductions to biodiversity uplift and long-term stewardship, this conversation reveals how thoughtful urban greening can reshape experience, behaviour and connection in the heart of the city. And it provides a great companion episode to last year's one on New York's High Line.
Hi, yes, I'm Andy Harris. I'm a director at John McAlison & Partners. We're a multidisciplinary design firm, and I'm a landscape architect, and I've been working on Sloane Street for it started almost just over 10 years ago.
And I'm Andy Sturgeon. I'm a landscape architect and garden designer, and we were involved with John McAlison's taking care particularly of the horticulture and the planting.
Okay, so tell me about this project and what stage it's currently at.
So Sloane Street was actually completed this year, and as I mentioned earlier, it's been ongoing for about 10 years in a stop-start capacity, but it's finally completed. And we first became involved with working with Cadogan Estate, who are our client. And for those who don't know, Sloane Street is in the heart of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and it's a kilometre long, and it stretches from Knightsbridge in the north near Harrods all the way down to Sloane Square. And crucially, it's part of the Cadogan Estate. And Cadogan Estate is one of the great estates in London. The estate owns many of the buildings around the street, most of the buildings, in fact. And Cadogan are a fantastic custodian of the public realm, and they're greatly interested in the local community, local business, and differ from many developers, I suppose, in the sense that they have a sort of unique long-term outlook. They've been around for 300 years or more, and I think the reason we became involved is because they recognised that Sloane Street, which is a combination of both a kind of a retail street, luxury retail, and a residential street, over the years had fallen into a certain amount of disrepair, and it felt like a street dominated by traffic. It wasn't a very kind environment to pedestrians. The condition of the streetscape was quite poor. A lot of mixed paving surfaces, lack of greenery, and they realised that the street, both in terms of their retailers and for the local community, wasn't really performing. So they set about looking at how they could make a sort of a once in a generation really change to a street which really hadn't been updated for hundreds of years.
And Andy, how did you get involved? What did they come to you and say? What was their brief?
Well, one of the things they recognised was that Sloane Street, they referred to it as a kind of a dumbbell of a street, because it had very different character, had retail at both ends, and then quite a sort of quiet residential section in the middle. And one of the parts of the brief was to try and improve the connectivity from the north to the south, and create a landscape, architectural language, if you like, that would help lead people from one end of the street to the other, and to give it a kind of a design integrity. If you walk up the street, it's quite interesting architecturally. It's got many interesting historic buildings. It's also got some more recent and modern architecture, so it's quite disparate in terms of its architecture. And I think they saw the real opportunity for the landscape to knit the street together, and in particular connect the northern and southern ends together, and to tackle some of the key problems of the street, which included this sort of traffic-dominated corridor.
People would never choose, I don't think, to walk from one end of that street to the other because it was just not a very nice environment. So it's quite transformative.
In practical terms, I'm guessing you used both hard landscaping and planting to tie it all together and to kind of create a journey through the space that people might want to undertake. How did you do that practically?
Well, I think the key was, Andy Sturgeon and John McCaslin and partners worked very closely on this because, we essentially set up a framework for the street, because the key enabling factor, I suppose, in turning the street from what it was into what it is now, which is a sort of a very green, horticulturally diverse boulevard, was to reduce the width of the carriageway. We did a lot of studies early on, and we had to test it through traffic modelling, but our feeling was that it probably had overcapacity of about 40%, but we had to prove that through traffic modelling. Once we had done that, we were able to effectively take out a carriageway. Sloane Street had 4 carriageways in places, so we effectively took out a carriageway and widened the pavements, and that gave us a framework whereby we could start to look at, how do we get more trees in? How do we get planters in and introduce sort of this green boulevard, which right from the start was a key strategy for the street. And that's what sort of gave, if you like, we kind of set up the framework for the planting, which Andy has sort of beautifully carried out.
It's probably worth mentioning that for John McCaslin's, this is an incredibly complex project, a lot of which you don't see. So it wasn't just a question of putting plants and trees wherever you fancied. What's going on underground caused considerable headaches with basements and services and sewers and all that sort of stuff. So there was a lot to work around, and it's a real sort of swan in that respect, because it does look beautiful up above, but there's an awful lot going on underneath.
Did that require you to build up in terms of the planters and things? Was that part of it?
It's been a mixture of things, and it's been incredibly complex. Without actually carrying out the utility diversions, we'd have been very limited in what we could have achieved on the street. So we came up with a kind of a strategy for a series of planters, tree planting and pots along the street. And then that had to be tested against what was below ground. And we quickly found out that the original concept scheme that we had would only become viable if we carried out this sort of below ground surgery, if you like, of the utility. So we did trial trenches and trial holes along the street. I think we did probably 50 trial holes and trial pits to examine what was below the surface. And we also discovered hundreds of basements as well, which in some cases extended out into the carriageway. So the huge amount of coal cellars, which originally, you'd had your horse and cart coming along with coal and shoveled into the coal holes in the pavements, which are still there in many places. So we had these below ground obstructions, which were prevalent along the entire street. So we were a kind of a utility company that specializes in consolidating utilities and diverting them together, because it can be a very long and painful process if you try and approaching individual companies. So we did it in that way, and where we could, we diverted the utilities to allow the introduction of planters and in-ground trees. So even the planters have foundations, so you need a certain amount of depth to accommodate them. And it's a very dynamic process, actually, because right through the site works, we were discovering new obstructions, new utilities, redundant utilities, and we had to adapt to the design as we went along. And in some cases, we couldn't. And actually, the pots, the round pots, which you'll see on the street if you walk down, were a very late addition, because we realised that we needed the flexibility to introduce pots that actually sat on the pavement level to ensure that we could continue this green corridor. So yeah, Andy's right. The utilities were, along with the traffic modelling and the carriageway narrowing, were the two most significant enabling factors to allow the scheme to happen.
And you mentioned the pollution. You've got all that amount of traffic. You've also got the issue of the climate, especially in central London. That sounds like quite a tough brief, Andy, for the planting.
Well, I think a lot of work that we do in London, or I suppose in any city, they are hostile environments for plants. They're very extreme. And then you often have constrained root zones, you have drought frequently, and then you have the climate, whatever that might be doing. But then you also have people. And in a place like Sloane Street, you have many people, and people, although these plants are raised, will quite happily walk their dogs in a raised planter. They'll quite happily lie down in a planter. And so the planting has to be resilient, not just to the climate, but to lots of sort of physical things as well. And then coupled with that, they're relatively small areas. So we had to try and get a high impact out of quite small areas. As Andy said, it's a kilometre long street, and we have got all these planters and trees, but they're not everywhere. So they had to work pretty hard, and you had to make sure that these planters and the plants were exerting an influence and creating a character on the street wherever you might be. And because of all the constraints that Andy mentioned, there are more plants in some areas than there are in others. And we had to make sure that we were taking on the character of the whole street. And then, with the pollution, removing some of the traffic was a big part of changing that. And so we adopted planting, which in some ways, it creates a physical barrier. One of the best way to stop pollutants is to put something between you and the car. So the heights of hedges, for example, that we have in there. So you can imagine if somebody's pushing a child in a buggy down the street, there's literally a physical barrier in some places where you have the planting between you and the car. Some plants will trap pollutants and deal with them in that way, but the physical approach is better than anything else. But it's also about bringing people into contact with that greenery wherever they might be in the street, and also to create this journey and bring joy to that journey that wasn't there before, so that you might choose to walk from one end to the other and have this sort of green experience as you go down there. But one of our greatest challenges, I think, was probably the fact that it has to function 365 days of the year. It has to look great, not just good, but it has to look great for 365 days of the year. This is a very significant high-end retail destination, and getting something to function that well so consistently in relatively small spaces is really quite difficult. And so I think at the beginning of this conversation, Andy mentioned that the Sloane Street was finished, and it is for him. In some ways, for us, it's finished, but it's very ongoing. So we're still reviewing planting, and things change, and such is the nature of planting. Some things thrive and some things survive and some things die, and not always for any reason that you can particularly put your finger on. And so we are constantly reviewing and changing and adding and tweaking it to get it to do what it needs to do.
So who will be looking after it long term? And I suspect with this project, given the backers, it might not be such an issue, but there is sometimes the issue of putting in new design and then finding that you don't have the resources to manage it. But
yeah, that's unfortunately very common to have that scenario. We're blessed with Cadogan as a client in that respect, because they are putting the resource into it to do a level of maintenance that is much higher than other similar projects might be. So we do have a luxury of being able to go back and improve and tweak and make sure it stays on track the whole time, which you just wouldn't get with another project. And so we're reviewing it constantly 4 times a year. We're having a thorough review and then making changes on the back of that. So yeah, that is pretty unusual. So we're very happy with that, and hopefully Shakanor as well.
I think that's one of the great things about working with Cadogan, is that they do have this kind of attitude to custodianship, and this type of scheme would never really be possible under normal circumstances without this sort of private injection of funding, because there are agreements that have taken place where Cadogan have agreed to sort of maintain the planting and the planters and all those elements that you would not normally necessarily find on a streetscape. And we've even got an irrigation system in the public realm, which is extremely rare. And I can't think of another street offhand that would have an irrigation system embedded within the scheme. So That's it's a particularly good example, I think, of public-private contribution to a scheme, because ultimately RBKC will maintain most of the street. It's a highway, so the council is responsible for it, but Cadogan have invested heavily and will continue to maintain a lot of the planting that Andy has designed.
I'm going to come back on to how it works and how it benefits people. But was it said to you, we want to do this for these groups of people?
As I said earlier on, it's an interesting street because it's retail at two ends and it's also residential in the centre. So you've instantly got this dual interest, if you like, of the community and this sort of international retail destination, which Sloane Street is. So, Cadogan have a genuine interest in both those elements. I mean, commercially, it's very important to them that the retail is a success. But also they're very conscious of their local community and providing facilities for the local community. And I don't know if you've been to Pavilion Road. Is a great example of where they've introduced almost like a sort of a village centre with a baker, a cheesemonger, a bakery, and that sort of giving back something to the community. So I think in this case, Sloane Street was doing both. From a commercial perspective, they realized that sort of luxury retail element was, quite a fragile thing, and there's a huge amount of competition from the internet shopping, airports, the Westfields of this world, where you can buy these luxury goods. So, I think there's been a lot in the press about how high streets have struggled and need to adapt and change to become more destinations. So certainly, from that perspective, Cadogan were keen to introduce public realm that was commensurate with these fantastic luxury fashion houses, but equally providing something for the community, providing a green environment, places where people can linger and sit and be protected from the traffic on the street. Reduction in the speed of vehicles, because that was always a problem on Sloane Street. Vehicles, I think 35% of vehicles were sort of found to be speeding on the street because it was so wide. So the narrowing of the carriageways reduced traffic speeds, which makes people feel safer. The introduction of the planters and the pots have reduced crime because they're sort of discouraging ram raiding on the shop fronts, which was a real problem. But perhaps, most importantly, it's starting to bring sort of the sort of garden quality out onto the street. And it's a very densely populated area, and there's quite a bit of green space, but most of it is private. The Cadogan Place Gardens on the street is a beautiful garden square, but it's only accessible to key holders. So one of the key ideas within the scheme is to try and bring that sort of garden environment out onto the street. And you can particularly see that on the central section of the street where, because of the lack of utilities, we really managed to maximize the amount of planting within the pavement. And that's now, fantastic with Andy's planting. It's a fantastic kind of sort of green avenue as you walk past the Cadogan Place Gardens, also enjoy sensory experience of the planting on the street as well.
In the material that was sent over to me, it mentioned that there's been an increase in the urban greening factor. Could you explain what that is for anyone that's not aware of it?
Well, it's a metric which is now applied to new developments, and it's not the best thing in the world for measuring these things, but it is a good metric. So you measure things in different ways, and different types of planting have different weights, basically. But we've been able to increase the urban greening. It's normally applied to new developments. So if you're building a new office block or something in London, it's meant to be driving the green aspect of that project. Now, that was always driving this project. So it wasn't the benchmark that we were trying to hit, but it now is quite a useful tool for applying to this and measuring what we've done. And I think the increase in urban green factor is 17%, which is quite good. But it's actually the biodiversity increase, which has gone up, I think, by 175%, which is much more significant. And it's been brought about really through the number of new trees and just the quantum of planting, with over 60 planted in the scheme, and then all the new trees, it has been a significant uplift.
Yeah, I think tree cover has increased by just over 50% and predicted to rise by 214% in a few years.
Yeah, I mean, as those canopies grow and broaden, they're going to have an increasing significant impact on the greening of this street and everything that brings with it.
So you mentioned obviously that it's quite a unique situation given the land owners, managers and the funding situation. So I was going to ask, could it potentially become a blueprint for other developments in the city? But possibly not. But will people be able to take elements, as you say, the kind of effect that it has on people walking along the street, the effect that it'll have on biodiversity net gain? Perhaps people can take other elements from it and be inspired.
I mean, Cadogan have really stepped out and done a significant project here, but it is part of a general trend in urban greening, but also local initiatives. You know, you're seeing a lot of temporary planter schemes popping up in places like Regent Street, which are sort of, I suppose, they are temporary quick fixes in a way, whereas this is something which is a forever project in that respect, and much greater and much more extensive. But it is something which is part of a trend, and I really hope that this will initiate some other projects of a similar ilk around the city.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, because it's funny, you've got the proximity to the Chelsea Flower Show and you've got the Chelsea Physic Garden there. It's almost as if that area has become known for horticulture, or is it the fact that these things are just contagious? You know, you see people putting planters out and then everybody thinks, oh, that looks really lovely, let's do something more. Do you think it is just that it's becoming a trend and people are picking up on it and doing more of it?
I think you're right, it is contagious. And it has been interesting through this process where Cadogan, you know, there has been reference to the Chelsea Physic Garden, Chelsea Flower Show, and Chelsea in Bloom particularly, that goes on around the time of Chelsea Flower Show, because that has been very contagious and has spread all these temporary displays which appear outside some of the shops. It's now become quite a spectacular event, and people are proud to be part of it. Cadogan are proud to be part of it. It has become part of the community, and it does feel like it's only going in one direction, and everything is now becoming greener, which is really quite exciting.
Yeah, it is, definitely. And I was going to ask you, you know, were you inspired by anywhere in particular when you were looking at this area? Because it is a tricky site, no two ways about it. Did you look at any other kind of city plantings and think, yes, that could be the way forward?
We looked at a number of retail streets, particularly luxury retail streets, and we looked at places like Avenue Montaigne in Paris, which are very green, and they're green, you know, mostly because they have very contiguous tree planting, which is fantastic. But there are actually very few examples that we could find that were similar to what we've done on Sloane Street. It's relatively unique what we've achieved, probably because of the amount of utility diversions that have been involved in the process, and also, you know, the willingness for Cadogan to sort of provide that sort of custodianship over the completed scheme. So we did look at many different examples, but there weren't many that we can honestly say are sort of direct precedents that we've used. Planting on streets, particularly the type of planting that Andy has done, has gone out of fashion in many ways, I think, over the years, as local authority budgets have weakened. The sort of the horticultural mixes that Andy's used, you don't see them so often in the public realm in streetscapes as you might have done in the past, I think.
Have you included those, Andy, because they're easier to care for?
Well, I mean, I think with the higher level of maintenance, it's allowed us to use things that we might not have used in a scheme that had lower levels of maintenance, because they might have petered out or whatever, been competed against by other neighbouring plants or something like that, or require a higher level of horticulture to keep them alive and looking good. So we have been able to swing the scheme in that direction. You know, if you think about the good old days of parks departments and that sort of thing, where they grew their own plants, they did big bedding displays, the sort of thing you only see outside Buckingham Palace now. And all that's really gone out of all local authorities because they simply don't have the money or the skilled labour force to look after it. So with this, it's a little bit looking in the past in that way, because we have got that benefit of being able to apply resource and do something that's spectacular.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Andy Harris and Andy Sturgeon, and the story behind this transformation of Sloane Street. If this episode resonated with you, you might also enjoy the episode on the High Line, which explores how landscape-led thinking can reshape urban life, and Wildflowers, Community and Urban Nature, which looks at the power of planting to reconnect people with nature in cities. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and thank you as always for listening. Next up is Benny with his Insect of the Week. But first, a word from our first ever sponsors of Insect of the Week. Hurrah! Please check out their website and support them if you can. I don't ask very much of you despite delivering all this amazing content. And now you have the added bonus of Benny. So do please check out this business, which I think very much aligns with the values of Roots and All. Thank you.
To the healers, dreamers, and keepers of the old ways, listening to Bud of the Week. Hello from the heart of Wales. Here at Cerddor's Herbs, we carefully craft our herbal blends and pouches. Every herb is sourced in the UK, then handcrafted into 100% natural products, wrapped in fully recyclable and biodegradable packaging. We care for the planet as it cares for us. Inspired by an ancient wisdom for the wanderers and dreamers of today, we invite you to slow down and sit with our Pacifica blend and connect with a simpler, more enchanted way of living. Begin your journey at Cerddor's Herbs and use the code BUDPODS for a special discount at checkout.
The seven-spot ladybird, scientific name Coccinella septempunctata. Now this is a species that you could potentially see right now in the middle of January in the winter. It is a species of ladybird that overwinters as an adult in a dormant state, in a diapause state, and can be found nestled in amongst leaf litter or in upright stems, in the seed heads, in all sorts of places, even in kind of very non-native shrubs, you can find them. It is the most common ladybird in the UK, apparently. It's been introduced into America for biological control, which seems crazy to me, given that the ladybird diversity in America will be far greater than here. It's native to Asia as well. It is known as aphidophagus. Now, I love that word. Phagus comes from the Greek to eat, loosely. And it's not just the adults that eat the aphids, but they also eat pollen and nectar. They consume pollen and nectar. The larvae, the young, the developing young, before the adult state, they will consume vast numbers of aphids. It can be quite a famous sight to have these kind of like almost armored-looking tank ladybird larvae on plants devouring aphids. So a really, really important piece of ecology in the garden or in a more lateral landscape. So aphidophagus, larvae and adults. Now, in terms of identification, seven-spot ladybirds are probably the easiest one to get your head around. So on the elytra or the wing cases, the red shell-looking part of the ladybird, you've got 3 spots on each side, and then you've got 1 on the central line just behind the thorax, the black and white area. So that should be quite an easy one to get your head around if you haven't tried to identify ladybirds before. There are other possible lookalikes. There is a scarce 7-spot ladybird, scientific name Coccinella magnifica, but this one is found in kind of woodlands and heathlands, often near wood ants, so it's much less likely to be in your garden. And the central spots on the scarce 7-spot ladybird are larger in size, so it's quite subtle, but you're much less likely to see that one. You could also potentially confuse it if you weren't counting spots with like a 10-spot ladybird or even harlequin ladybirds, which come in very, very many different appearances. So I do think it is probably the easiest one to identify. So if you haven't kind of recorded or identified a ladybird before, it's probably a really good one to start, given how common it is and given how easy it is to identify largely. So I record insects on an app called iRecord. Some people use iNaturalist, but the scientific community that I'm in kind of encourages the iRecord app. But I think it's personal preference. They both have slightly different functions and usability. So I would highly recommend you recording any insects you see, because even the most common species, the records are really valuable just to know when they're out, and in the future, if any of them are declining, we might know, where they've been most recently recorded, and so on. So please do start to consider recording the wildlife you see. iRecord or iNaturalist, and you could always ask for a little help if you are in need of some. But I think given that it's winter, it's kind of mid-January, I think because this species is so present at the minute, I'd love you to go outside and look for some. And I reckon you can find some quite easily.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.